Part 11. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn. I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 112. There is no time. I have to go. Shen Yu lowered her voice. Girl, Ji Liangji suddenly spoke and looked at her seriously. Listen to me and stop checking. If you are also guilty of this, let me explain to your father. Shen Yu looked at him deeply and walked towards the end of the dark prison without saying a word. As soon as she stood firm at the door, a group of people came hurriedly. The ones in front were the people from Dali Temple, and behind them were the guards wearing flying fish uniforms. Fortunately, the person leading people at the front door was not Zozong, the young minister of Dali Temple, otherwise he would have been recognized. Before Shen Yu had time to think about it, the leader had already walked up to him. He was stunned when he saw the jailer. Why are you here too? The jailer said, Master Sichin, there is nothing we can do. I will behead him tomorrow. If something changes tonight, I will come over and keep an eye on him. Si nodded, showed his waist badge, and said, I have been ordered by your lord to assist the Jin Wei to pick up the person. Shen Yu couldn't leave now, so she could only go in with the jailer, while thinking about the advantages and disadvantages of this alleyway if it was exposed at this moment. The advantage is that street fighting cannot be used, and they cannot attack in groups. They can only attack in turns, but this means that once the opponent guards the exit, she cannot get out. The jailer opened the door. In the prison, Ji Liangji looked up and saw Shen Yu leaving and returning, and was stunned for a moment. But he quickly adjusted his expression and said, Jin Wei, your majesty must want to see me. The Jin Wei has always been under the direct control of the emperor, and no one can mobilize it except Emperor Tongxiu. Shen Yu was thinking in her heart, Ji Liangji would definitely be executed at noon tomorrow to show the anger of the people, but what was Emperor Tongxiu going to do in the middle of the night? Ji Liangji was taken out of the prison, and the prison was no longer important. Si Cheng threw away the key in his hand and said, lock it. The direction he threw it was towards Shen Yu. Shen Yu caught it and her palm sank. There was a bunch of heavy keys, and she couldn't tell which one locked the prison door. She held the key and thought about how to show it. As for whether the lock was locked or not, no one would check. Fortunately, the jailer was smart and snatched the key from Shen Yu's hand, and said impatiently, I'll do it, you clumsy one. Shen Yu waited for him to lock the door and walked to the door together. Si Cheng saw off the Jin Wei men, and when she turned around, she saw the two of them walking towards them. His eyes fell on Shen Yu, and a trace of suspicion suddenly flashed across his face. Shen Yu realized something was wrong and said quickly, it's okay if Jin Wei takes the person away. We can breathe a sigh of relief after taking him away. We don't have to worry anymore. Si Cheng turned his eyes and thought that he was right. Since the person had been taken away smoothly, it meant that there was no problem in Dali Temple, and this group was considered to have been handed over. The jailer said, Master Sichin, since we have taken him away, let's follow the previous arrangements. The people below have been on tenterhooks these past few days and are very tired. Si Chen nodded and said, everyone should go back when it's time to take over. The jailer stretched himself and said with a smile, I'll take the brothers to have a drink. They've been exhausted these days. He patted Shen Yu on the shoulder and said, let's go have a drink with me. Shen Yu followed Yu Cheng, and Yu Cheng took her out of Dali Temple, and then he breathed a sigh of relief. Just when he was about to speak, Shen Yu made a silent gesture and looked towards the end of the palace alley. Before the Jin Wei people had gone far, the prison van carrying Ji Liangji rattled on the stone road. Shen Yu turned her head and whispered, I won't go back now. Just tell him that I will be back at noon tomorrow at the latest. The jailer said oh, but before he could stop him, he saw a figure rising from the ground, flying up the wall, and then disappeared into the darkness with a few twists. What a handsome kung fu, Yu Cheng couldn't help but praise. Jin Yiwei's prison car was walking in the palace alley, and Shen Yu was running on the eaves, taking off her Dali Temple jailer's clothes as she ran, leaving only her night clothes, and she quickly passed the group of people. The Jin Yiwei were all top-notch masters, so she didn't dare to get too close. After running for a while, she silently slid down the wall and lay on the ground, waiting for an opportunity. As the prison car came closer and closer, she pinched the pebbles she picked up and threw them at the right spot. The pebbles hit the eaves and the tiles shattered. "Who is it?" Jin Yiwei stopped and stood. The tiles fell down, and when they were not paying attention, Shen Yu rolled under the prison car, clung to the bottom of the prison car, and followed the prison car into the palace. The prison car drove for what seemed a long way until it stopped in front of a palace. Emperor Tongxue leaned on the couch. When Ji Liangji came closer, he took a closer look and suddenly said, "Old Ji, why are you like this?" Ji Liangji took 2 steps forward, the iron rods on his hands and feet rattled. "The same goes for your majesty." Old Tongxue shook his head and said, "We are all old. Back then, that's all. Let's sit down and have a sip of tea. It's a treat for us as kings and ministers. I'll say goodbye to you." Ji Liangji sat down behind the case, took a sip of tea, and praised, "Good tea. Can you tell what kind of tea it is?" Ji Liangji shook his head. As if he was just asking a casual question, Emperor Tongxue changed the subject. "There is no one around me who I can trust, and no one who can speak freely." Ji Liangji said, "Your Majesty thought that the guilty minister was still a dead man and could bring secrets underground, so he asked the guilty minister to come tonight, right?" Emperor Tongxue sighed, "Old Ji, you used to be the minister of the Ministry of Revenue. From your position, you should be able to see most clearly that my country has been hollowed out by these moths." Ji Liangji smiled and said, "The worm in your Majesty's mouth is actually one of the sinners." Emperor Tongxue was stunned. "Yes." Shen Yu lay on the roof and listened carefully. She took out a small piece of the roof tile, just enough to see everything below. This was the first time she had seen Emperor Tongxue. He was very different from what she had imagined the emperor would look like. He looked no different from an ordinary old man, even more tired and vicissitudes of life. The conversation continues below. "I, the emperor, have been frustrated." Emperor Tongxue took a sip of strong tea to refresh himself. "Although I am the emperor, I can't help myself just like you. Sometimes it's not that I want to be like this, but the situation pushes me. It has to be done. When I took over the great Zhou dynasty from the late emperor, it was already riddled with holes. I once thought about doing something great, but after working hard all my life, I only solved one of the 5 major evils. The 5 major evils are fratricide, eunuchs fighting for power, traitors running rampant, internal party strife, and external powerful enemies. Emperor Tongxue got rid of the eunuchs, which was actually a great achievement. 6 of my sons died at the hands of each other. 6, Emperor Tongxue said with tears in his eyes. Now there are only a few of them left. Ji Feng can just be like this. I envy him. He is the prince who lives the most comfortable life. He is benevolent and virtuous. It is a good thing and a bad thing for an emperor to be too benevolent. If he was born in the Taiping year, he will definitely become a good emperor, but he was born at the wrong time. This dilapidated country needs a courageous emperor. The prince is courageous and capable, but, that's all." Ji Liangji said, "That's better than the guilty ministers. Now the children and family members of the guilty ministers are exiled, and they live as prostitutes." The 2 of them chatted until dawn, just like old friends, and did not mention any key news. Except for Emperor Tongxue's "that's all." What is hidden in that helpless "that's all"? Is it related to the Yan Liangwen case? Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 113. There was a faint light on the horizon, and Shen Yu knew that she could not stay any longer. The roofs of the Forbidden Palace are all made of bright yellow glazed tiles. Her night clothes can still hide her in the dark, and she will be obvious as soon as it gets light. She glanced in the direction of the palace gate, jumped down, and landed quietly, hiding behind a pillar, waiting for the patrolling guards to disperse before sneaking out. Who? Shen Yu was shocked, looked back, and secretly screamed. God is not as good as man. Who would have thought that one of the guards in the line would fall behind and bump into him as soon as he came out? There's an assassin. The sound of swords suddenly sounded, and the guards immediately drew their swords and faced each other. Shen Yu didn't bring a knife tonight. She only took out a short dagger from her waist. After holding someone up, she grabbed the other person's knife. She didn't make a killing move. She fought off a few people with her sword and turned around to see black guards coming from all directions. Countless torches lit up the dawning sky. Shen Yu's heart sank. There were too many guards, and even in a will battle, she would not be able to survive until the end. For the current plan, we can only retreat but not fight. After making up her mind, Shen Yu held a guard in front of her and retreated. She quickly took out the powder from her purse, pushed the guard away and scattered it in the air. The guards hurriedly covered their mouths and noses, and if they accidentally inhaled it, they immediately fell to the ground. However, in a flash, the assassin had already climbed up the high wall and disappeared in the blink of an eye. The guard said, "No." The assassin went towards the East Palace. The sky gradually became brighter, and at Chen time, the officials went down to court. Xie stayed up all night and closed his eyes to rest in the carriage. In the early morning, the jailer came to report, and Xie guessed that she had followed the Jin Yiwei into the palace, hoping to find out the news. She is really becoming more and more courageous. What kind of place is the Forbidden Palace? She dares to break into it because of her great skills. The carriage drove all the way into the Forbidden Palace and got off the carriage. 11 Feng immediately stepped forward and whispered beside Xie, "There were assassins in the palace this morning." The Jin Yiwei saw that they were heading towards the East Palace and turned the East Palace upside down. Chao Tian couldn't find anyone. Xie said, "Since we haven't found her, it means she is still safe now. She just can't get out of the palace. Let's go to the East Palace." "But he must not be in the East Palace now. Let's go." Xie looked at the long palace alley. "I just went to tell her that I was here to pick her up. Once she knows that I am coming, she should be able to find a way to return to the East Palace. The safest place is the most dangerous place. If she leaves the East Palace during the search, she will definitely want to return to the East Palace afterwards to avoid searches in other places." Xie walked to the Chongming Gate. When he entered the East Palace, he paused slightly and looked towards the other side of the palace road. The eunuch in charge of the East Palace came to greet them. Following his line of sight, he saw several slender palace ladies walking farther and farther along the palace road. "That's the palace maid who went out to buy something," the eunuch said. "His Royal Highness, please come inside. The prince and the princess have been waiting for a long time." The palace maid's clothes on Shen Yu were a little too small. She took them off from a palace maid, and they made her feel a little uncomfortable. She actually stayed in the East Palace and never left. When searching the palace, she changed into the clothes of a palace maid and pretended to be a palace maid. After knocking out a palace maid, she shouted that there was an assassin, and then she fell down and was carried away. "Go out." The East Palace searched all over, but no one expected that the male assassin would disguise himself as a palace maid. Shen Yu followed with her head lowered, fearing that her secret would be revealed when she opened her mouth, so she turned around the palace wall. "Stop!" the eunuch said in a long voice. "Where are you guys going?" Shen Yu secretly raised her eyes and glanced. There was a peacock embroidered on the eunuch's robe, and he should be a master. The leading maid saluted, "If you want to return to your father-in-law, a few servants will go out of the palace to purchase on the orders of the crown princess." "It takes so many people to go out to the palace to purchase goods?" Lu Feng asked. The palace maid quickly stuffed something into the eunuch's hand and said with a smile, "Eunuch Lu, you are a sensible person." Lu Feng weighed the silver in his hand and found that the weight was quite satisfactory. He also knew that ordinary palace maids would not go out of the palace once every few years. Whenever there was a shopping trip out of the palace, they would try their best to get there, and sometimes they would bring 2 more people with them. Go. Lu Feng waved his hand. Shen Yu followed behind, and when she passed by the eunuch, the startling glance on her side made Lu Feng stare. "Wait a minute." Lu Feng took 2 steps forward and stopped in front of Shen Yu. He raised the whisk in his hand and lifted Shen Yu's chin. The palace maid who led the way was so anxious that she broke out in cold sweat. She was afraid that her secret would be exposed. Shen Yu drugged her. Without an antidote, she would definitely die. Shen Yu's hand had already tightened the dagger in her sleeve, and when she was about to take action, she heard the eunuch tisk-tisk twice. She quietly put the dagger back. Lu Feng circled around her half a circle, pinched his voice and said, with such a look, "It would be a pity to be a mere shopping maid." Shen Yu didn't answer. Lu Feng said in a drawl, "You have to accept your fate when you enter this forbidden palace. If you don't climb up, there will be people stepping on you to climb up." He took Shen Yu's hand, and Shen Yu quickly clenched her fists, fearing that he would notice the calluses on her hands. Lu Feng just thought she was unhappy, squeezed her hand, patted it, and said, "Look at your appearance, you are a lucky person. Do you want us to change your job for you?" Lu Feng looked at her face and felt that it was getting better and better as he looked at her. The masters in the palace didn't notice her appearance, which was an advantage for him. Shen Yu had heard that the eunuchs and maids in the palace would find the right food, but she didn't expect that this damn eunuch would dare to set his sights on her. Shen Yu looked at the hand caressing the back of her hand. If she hadn't been trapped here now, she would have chopped off this cowardly eunuch. Shen Yu lowered her head and said, "This servant is still in a hurry to leave the palace to buy something." Lu Feng saw that she was so unappreciative, so he threw her hand away and said angrily, "Humph, you don't want the grace given to you. Don't say that our family won't support you when the time comes." Suddenly a voice came from the palace alley. "A eunuch dares to speak arrogant words to give people grace." When Lu Feng heard this, his legs immediately softened and he knelt on the ground. "Your Highness, Fourth Highness." The palace maid immediately knelt on the ground, and Shen Yu had no choice but to kneel down. She had also heard the name of the 4th prince this morning, Li Zhaonian. In Emperor Tongxiu's words, he was worthy of the word benevolence and righteousness. "You might as well tell me what kind of grace you can give," Li Zhaonian said. Lu Feng paled in panic. The slave was just joking with them. Grace is naturally given by the masters. The slave is just a dog. It is the slave's turn to give grace. Li Zhaonian snorted coldly, "That's not what I heard just now." Lu Feng slapped himself immediately. "Look at this slave's mouth. He can't speak. Please forgive me, Your Highness. The eunuchs in the palace are the ones who watch what is served. The more arrogant they are with their front feet, the more groveling they can be with their back feet." Li Zhaonian scolded, "Get out of here." Lu Feng quickly knelt aside. Shen Yu lowered his head and could only see a pair of Ruyi pattern court boots under the python robe, and the person beside him, who had a pair of cloud head shoes under the court robe. "You, raise your head," Li Zhaonian said. Shen Yu had no idea who he was referring to. Someone suddenly turned her arm, and the palace maid whispered beside her, "His Highness is calling you." Shen Yu gritted her teeth and slowly raised her head. Li Zhaonian looked at that plain face like a lotus flower, and it was indeed beautiful. Just as he was about to speak, he saw her looking at the person beside him, and her expression suddenly changed. Li Zhaonian turned his head, and the person beside him also looked shocked. Li Zhaonian asked doubtfully, Lianzi, do you know him? You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Treating the Concubine, Eliminating the Wife, Reborn, I Refuse to Marry the Scumbag and Marry the Prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 114. Zhang Lianzi's hands hidden under his sleeves trembled slightly, unable to control the ecstasy in his heart. He had been looking for her for so long, almost to the point of despair, that she would appear in front of him in such a way. His Adam's apple rolled up and he said in a harsh voice, "We know you." Shen Yu clenched the dagger in her hand, and her other hand on the ground began to accumulate strength. If you can take any one of them hostage, you should be able to escape. But that was the last resort. Once the hostages were taken, she could not stay in the palace any longer, otherwise it would drag down Xietingzhou. Thinking of this, she felt a trace of reluctance in her heart. Li Zhaonian looked surprised. This was the first time he saw Zhang Lianzi lose his composure. How did you meet? Shen Yu stared at Zhang Lianzhou. Zhang Lianzi calmed down and said slowly, I wonder if your highness will remember my mentor. Li Zhaonian nodded thoughtfully and said, Lin Xiao was convicted of corruption. I once heard that you and his daughter were childhood sweethearts. Zhang Lianzi hurriedly looked at Shen Yu's face, fearing that he would see a hint of displeasure on her face. But after seeing her expressionless face, I felt faintly disappointed. Although my mentor has been executed, once he is a teacher, he is always a father. My mentor's daughter and I are not childhood sweethearts. Li Zhaonian said, what does that have to do with the person in front of me? Zhang Lianzi said, she is a distant relative. Her family was implicated when the teacher was convicted, and she entered the palace for unknown reasons. Li Zhaonian thoughtfully said, a group of people came into the palace the year before last. I guess they came in at that time, right? Shen Yu had dug up all the ancestral graves of Zhang Lian's family in her heart. He was really good at lying, and his lies actually brought blame on the Lin family. Lin Qingli pushed her into the water in her previous life. If he hadn't mentioned it, she would have been so busy that she almost forgot about Lin Qingli. But since he mentioned it, when she has time, she must take good care of Lin Qingli, so as not to make her life too comfortable. Shen Yu, go back to your highness, that's right. Li Zhaonian nodded, stop kneeling, get up. Then he said to Zhang Lianzi, Brother Huang was frightened last night, so we should go to the East Palace to visit him first. Zhang Lianzi was silent, glanced at Shen Yu, then picked up his robe and knelt down. Li Zhaonian was shocked, and when he looked at Shen Yu, he understood, but for this palace maid. Zhang Lianzi said, now that I have seen it, I can't just sit back and watch, hoping that His Highness will fulfill my wish. Help your grandpa. Shen Yu had already cordially greeted Guo Zhang Lianzi's 18th generation ancestors. If he hadn't interfered, she and the palace maid would have been able to leave the palace smoothly on the pretext of purchasing. Do you need to worry about this leisurely thing? It's just for a palace maid, for Li Zhaonian it's just a matter of opening his mouth. Lianzi gets up first. Li Zhaonian helped him up personally and said, it's not difficult to be a palace maid. It's just that the assassin appeared last night. The assassin hasn't been found yet. It's better to wait for 2 days. Seeing Zhang Lian's face solemn, he said, that's all, the assassin can't be her. You take her away. If anything happens, I'll be responsible for it. Zhang Lianzi stood up, clasped his hands and thanked him, thank you, Your Highness, for this. He knew that Shen Yu would be in more danger if she stayed in the palace for a moment longer, but he still had to go to the East Palace first. Just as he was thinking about how to arrange it, he saw a small yellow gate running towards him along the palace alley. Your Highness, Fourth Highness, Mr. Zhang Xiao Huangman saluted and said, His Royal Highness heard that the two of you were coming and asked the servant to convey that the East Palace is welcoming guests. For fear that there will be too many people, the reception will not be adequate. His Highness will host a banquet in person later. Someone is faster than us. Li Zhaonian smiled. It doesn't matter, we can come back another day. Zhang Lianzi took advantage of the situation and said, in that case, we will come back to visit His Royal Highness another day. Li Zhaonian glanced at Shen Yu, smiled knowingly, and said to Zhang Lianzi, it's rare to see you so anxious. Zhang Lianzi was stunned. Your Highness is joking. You are thin-skinned, so I won't make fun of you. Li Zhaonian said, you can take people away. Thank you, Your Highness. I will take my leave. Zhang Lianzi walked up to Shen Yu and whispered, follow me. Shen Yu followed him silently, thinking that it would be the same if she knocked him out after leaving the palace. Someone suddenly tugged on my sleeve, and the palace maid who was doing the shopping followed me and asked in a low voice, then, why don't you go out to buy with us? Of course Shen Yu knew what she meant. She pretended to drug them when they held her hostage. She was worried that there was no antidote. She thrust a note into the palace maid's hand. We were just going to Dali Temple last night. Who would have thought that he would bring a life-threatening poison with him, just to scare her? Otherwise, how could he take her out of the palace obediently? There were only 2 words on the note, telling the palace maid that it was not poisonous. The palace walls are towering and the palace lanes are deep. Shen Yu followed Zhang Lianzi, and the voices of Xiao Huangman talking to Li Zhaonian came along the palace alley. Which distinguished guest is your brother receiving today? It's His Royal Highness Balin Crown Prince. Shen Yu's steps suddenly stopped. Sensing something strange, Zhang Lianzi turned around, with a hint of doubt in his eyes. Shen Yu lowered her eyes. She didn't know whether Xie Ting's visit to the East Palace was a coincidence, or whether he came to her deliberately. This problem continued to bother her until she was released from the ban. The palace gate has 3 levels, and you can take a carriage outside the Forbidden Palace, but there are 2 gates for inspection along the way. Shen Yu sat near the carriage shaft, lifted the curtain and took a look outside. Today's duty has doubled, and the interrogation has become much stricter. Zhang Lianzi just took her out because of the reward from His Highness the 4th Highness. Zhang Lianzi looked at her profile and asked in a low voice, are you the assassin in the palace? Shen Yu was still looking out the window. Why can't I understand what Mr. Zhang said? I am the maid of the East Palace. Didn't you also see it? Zhang Lianzi pursed his lips. They say you're dead. What's going on? It seems that Mr. Zhang is also looking forward to my death. Shen Yu turned around and said. Zhang Lianzi's expression changed and she smiled indifferently, it's just a joke. Then you have to ask my good sister. I'm also curious about why I died inexplicably. In an instant, Zhang Lianzi figured it out. He pondered for a moment and said, what are your plans now? I can explain to His Majesty the misunderstanding and return your identity. That's not necessary. Shen Yu refused. I have my own plans for my own affairs, so I won't bother Mr. Zhang to worry about it. What are your plans? Zhang Lianzi scolded. Are you putting yourself in danger like today? Shen Yu said, then in what capacity do you question me? Zhang Lianzi was stunned for a moment and said, I saved you. Shen Yu snorted coldly, how do you know you didn't ruin my plan? Zhang Lianzi was silent for a moment. Auntie. Sir. Shen Yu interrupted him, I don't know where those rumors in the capital come from, and I don't know where your deep love comes from. In short, you and I have very little contact. We left the palace today, and you and I will return home. It's better not to go back and forth from now on. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 115. Zhang Lianzi looked at her face, why are you so hostile to me? Shen Yu was stunned. She had unknowingly brought in the emotions from her previous life, but in this life she was not married to Zhang Linzi, nothing had happened yet, and Zhang Linzi had even helped her. She turned away, not knowing how to explain. Compared with her previous life, she had changed so much that even if she was wearing inferior palace-made clothes, she could not conceal the light radiating from her body. Zhang Lianzi looked at it for a moment, then lowered his eyebrows and his eyes were hard to distinguish. "Are you pursuing your father's case?" Shen Yu looked at him but didn't answer. Zhang Lianzi continued, "It's not safe for you to walk outside now. I can help you. I will investigate General Shen's case." Shen Yu controlled her emotions. "I appreciate your kindness, but there's no need for it." Zhang Lianzi suddenly raised his voice, "I can't, can he just thank Ting Zhou?" Shen Yu looked at Zhang Lianzi in shock. How did he know? Zhang Lianzi looked sideways at the curtain, and the jealousy in his heart was about to burn the curtain. "To sum it up, I have met you twice before, but I just confirmed it." Once at the gate of Dali Temple, he saw some profiles but was not sure. That time he asked Xie Tingzhou who was in the carriage, and Xie Tingzhou replied, "My people." The other time was in the yamen of the capital. She had her back turned and was afraid to see anyone for fear of being exposed. Xie Tingzhou held her in his arms. If it hadn't been for the sudden step when she heard Xie Tingzhou in the East Palace just now, he still wouldn't have been able to completely connect with him. Thinking of this, Zhang Lianzi felt a deep anger surge in his heart. He lowered his eyes and stared at the tea on the table for a moment, then raised his hand to pour a cup and handed it to her. Shen Yu has traveled around the world for many years and is very wary of unfamiliar people, so she did not drink it after taking it, but put it on the table. Zhang Lianzi took the cup and took a sip himself, indicating that it was not poisonous. "You don't have to be so vigilant, I won't harm you." Shen Yu said, "I have a rather impatient temper. I offended a lot with my words just now. I hope you can forgive me." "It doesn't matter." Zhang Linzi smiled mockingly and said, "Last year before General Shen went on an expedition, I failed to stop him in the palace, and I felt quite guilty. It's good to know that you are still alive. If you encounter any difficulties in the future, you can come to Zhang Mansion to find me." The air in the carriage was dull, and Shen Yu opened a crack slightly. Seeing this, Zhang Lianzi took out an incense burner from under the table and lit it. "I don't know what kind of incense is burning in the stove. It's quiet and pleasant, and it smells fresh and refreshing." Shen Yu thought for a while and said, "There is indeed something that adults can do to help. You can speak up. I heard that Your Excellency sent a letter to Balin before the defeat, asking Prince Balin to send troops to Yanliang Pass. Is this true?" Zhang Lianzi was shocked in his heart, but his face showed no emotion. It seemed that Xie Tingzhou had nothing to hide from her and had told her everything. "Yes, I failed to stop your father, and what you said to me in front of the palace gate, I was worried about something happening at Yanliang Pass, so I wrote that letter." Shen Yu looked at him calmly. This statement was well-founded and impossible to refute, but she didn't believe it. She didn't believe that Zhang Lianzi would decide to write to Balin just because of her few words. Zhang Lianzi said again, "You don't believe it, do you?" Shen Yu was silent. Zhang Lianzi suddenly smiled, "You really can't tell lies. Even if you don't believe it, you should pretend to believe it, and then wait for an opportunity to find evidence to expose it." Shen Yu shook her head and said, "I don't want to spend time playing these tricks with you." The smile on Zhang Lianzi's face faltered, and he suddenly asked, "If I play tricks with you, will you be angry?" "What do you mean?" Shen Yu frowned. Just as she was about to ask again, she felt her body began to weaken and her vision became blurry. Shen Yu suddenly realized something was wrong. She clearly didn't drink tea. Correct. It's an incense burner. But Zhang Lianzi was obviously in the carriage, so why wasn't he poisoned? Without enough time to think about it, Shen Yu pulled out the dagger and rushed towards Zhang Lianzi, putting the dagger against his neck. Where's the antidote? Zhang Lianzi was not afraid and stared at her face. Then he stretched out his arms and hugged the fallen Shen Yu into his arms. He held her against him with one arm, took out the dagger from her hand and threw it on the ground, then picked up the tea on the table and poured it into the incense burner. The incense is in the incense burner, and the antidote is in the tea. An assassin entered the East Palace last night, and the prince stayed up all night. If you walk too much at night, you will always see ghosts. He has done a lot of bad things, so he is naturally worried that someone is coming to seek revenge. Prince Li Jinqing gathered his energy and hosted a banquet in honor of Xie Tingzhou. Li Jinqing knew that Xie Tingzhou was on good terms with Li Jifeng, but Li Jifeng was just a piece of mud who couldn't stand up to the wall and posed no threat to him. Balin is powerful, and if Xie Tingzhou can be used to his advantage, it will be a powerful boost. The sun was shining high, and the shadows of the trees outside the window fell into circles on the ground. Xie Tingzhou stood up to say goodbye, declining Li Jinqing's kindness in letting him have dinner. After leaving the East Palace, 11 Feng immediately followed him. No one was found in the palace, but there is one suspicion. Xie Tingzhou, say. 11 Feng said, in the morning, a eunuch was touching a palace maid outside the East Palace. He was caught by the fourth prince and Zhang Shilang. The fourth prince gave him to Zhang Shilang. Does Zhang Ji want it? If he didn't ask for it, it would be just an insignificant episode. If Zhang Lianzi asked for it, it would mean. Before Xie Tingzhou could finish thinking about it, Zifeng said, yes, after all, it's the person Zhang Shilang asked for himself. Xie Tingzhou's steps were confused. Go to Zhang Mansion. His jaw tightened a little. I want someone. Zhang Mansion. Zhang Lianzi's courtyard door was closed tightly. The servants lowered their voices as they walked, because the young master looked very ugly when he came back with the person in his arms. It was still the same yard as before, the yard where she had lived for 3 years. Zhang Lianzi put Shen Yu on the bed, stared at her face, and touched her with trembling hands, but stopped before he touched her. She said she didn't know where his deep love started. Where should she start? Perhaps it was the companionship of thousands of days and nights, but he finally gave away his heart unknowingly. But I missed it all by accident. Water dripped on the quilt, spreading a few wet spots. Zhang Lianzi held her hand and murmured, I will repay you double what I owe you in my previous life, okay? Auntie. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi. Chapter 116. When leaving the palace, 11 Feng unloaded the carriage. Xie Tingzhou got on his horse and rode directly back to the palace. Upon entering, he asked Qiu if he was back. There are several doors in the palace, and even when she came back, she didn't know which door she entered through. The servants checked with him before getting back to him, saying that Shiger hadn't come back at all. Xie Tingzhou's heart sank. On the way back, he also thought that she was good at martial arts and would be able to come back smoothly as long as she left the palace. If she didn't come back, there were only 2 reasons, either she was imprisoned or she voluntarily followed Zhang Lianzi back. Either of these 2 possibilities is unacceptable to Xie Tingzhou. Xie Tingzhou said coldly, you immediately mobilize people and surround Zhang Mansion. Not even a fly can fly out. After saying that, he got on the horse again. 11 Feng was horrified and took a few steps forward to persuade, Zhang Mansion is the residence of the Chief Minister Zhang Yuanqing. It is really inappropriate for us to go directly to the door to ask for someone like this. Xie Tingzhou didn't care what was wrong and turned the horse's head. 11 Feng hurried forward and grabbed the reins. Xie Tingzhou reined in his horse and said, get out of the way. 11 Feng stood firm in front of him, Your Majesty, think twice about surrounding the Zhang Mansion with great fanfare for a single guard. If this matter is so noisy, I'm afraid we will have to bring it to the attention of the Holy Emperor. Uncle Zhong heard that there was a commotion in the front yard and hurried over. When he heard what was going on, he was even more anxious than Xieting Zhou. That won't work. We have to take her back. Let's go to Zhang Mansion and turn it upside down. 11 Feng had a headache. He thought that Uncle Zhong would come to persuade him, but he got angry. Can you please stop getting involved? No, Uncle Zhong said to Xieting Zhou, look, Your Highness, we are going to the Zhang Mansion today. Didn't the Zhang family have a chief assistant and a minister? I heard that there are also side branches of the Zhang family. If you are an official in the court, your family will be powerful, but how can we be vegetarians in the prince's palace in the north? If we make such a fuss, His Majesty will definitely intervene. When asked about the reason, His Highness will boldly say that Minister Zhang has robbed our people. What do you think, Your Highness? The reins in Xieting Zhou's hands loosened. 11 Feng finally breathed a sigh of relief. Uncle Zhong was still an old fox, and this trick was very clever in going against the grain. 11 Feng came closer and said, Yes, Your Highness, I'm afraid that Shi Yi's intrusion into the Forbidden Palace will not be covered up by then. Xieting Zhou took a deep breath. He lost control under the word beloved. As long as he thought of her in Zhang Lianzi's hands, he couldn't care about anything. Seeing that he had softened, Xifeng took the opportunity to persuade, this matter needs to be discussed in the long term. Long-term plan? He thanked Ting Zhou for not accepting this trick. He didn't feel at ease leaving Shenyu with Zhang Lianzi for a moment. If he can't even bring back his beloved, his heir apparent will be in vain. Go and recruit people, he said calmly, bring rhubarb with you. 11 Feng's heart sank, and it seemed that he couldn't persuade him anymore. Xieting Zhou suddenly turned his head and said, have you forgotten? The people in Shengjing only know that I am a complete playboy in Bailin in the past few years. They have never really seen it. Today, let them see what a real playboy is. Before Xifeng and Uncle Zhong could react, Xieting Zhou had already waved his whip and rushed out at the lead. He raised his hand and whistled, and in response was a clear chirp of an eagle, followed by a seabird that roared and flapped its wings. The wind is so anxious that my head is big. Uncle Zhong looked at Xieting Zhou's back and laughed, this is our eagle to the north. How can the walls of Shengjing trap him? The yard was quiet for an hour, and suddenly there was a knock on the door outside the yard. Gao went in and looked at the person who knocked on the door. After listening for a while, his expression became serious, and he hurried back. Sir, something happened. Zhang Lianzi turned his head and asked, what's the matter? Gao Jin said outside, Bailin Crown Prince Xieting Zhou and his people have surrounded our house. The old man is recuperating and he doesn't dare to disturb us. Now the madam and the master are in the front hall to receive people. Zhang Lianzi never expected that Xieting Zhou would dare to lead troops directly to ask for someone. He originally thought that Xieting Zhou should be wary of the Zhang family, and would only do things in secret rather than in the open. Now that Xieting Zhou has made the matter so big, isn't he afraid of putting Shenyu in danger? Zhang Lianzi tucked himself in, lowered the curtain, walked out of the room and ordered, send someone to guard and don't let anyone in, otherwise we'll see you. Zhang Lianzi hurriedly came to the front hall, where Mrs. Zhang and Mr. Zhang were at a loss to deal with the bodhisattva on top. Seeing Zhang Lianzi step through the door, Mrs. Zhang hurriedly stepped forward, Lian. Before he finished calling his name, Mrs. Zhang noticed the blood on his neck, and then turned pale with shock, why is your neck bleeding? Zhang Lianzi didn't notice anything unusual. He raised his hand and touched his neck, which felt a slight tingling sensation. Shen Yu should have cut it with a dagger on the carriage. He was not paying attention to himself at the time, so he didn't notice it. It seemed that she had no affection for him at all, so she really had to kill him. It's okay, I touched it by accident. Zhang Lianzi looked at Xieting Zhou, who was sitting in the seat. I wonder if the prince is here, what are you doing? Xieting Zhou glanced at his neck, and there was a lot of blood. It looked like it was injured by a sharp weapon. Shen Yu probably had a hand with him, but she couldn't get away. Xieting Zhou felt even more anxious, but he smiled again. It's boring for Minister Zhang to be like this. Don't you know best what I'm going to do? Zhang Lianzi said, I don't know, please let me know for sure. Since Xieting Zhou went all out to ask for someone, it meant that Shen Yu was very important to him. He had just picked up Shen Yu from the palace in the morning, so he bet that Xieting Zhou didn't dare to speak out. Xieting Zhou turned the finger on his hand and said, I'm here to ask for someone. Zhang Lianzi's expression changed, and Xieting Zhou got up and walked towards him. A few days ago, I found a lovely little boy in Ziwiun Tower. I heard that he was brought back to the house by Minister Zhang. If he is an ordinary person, that's all. I'll give it to you. Xieting Zhou stopped in front of Zhang Lianzi. Unfortunately, that boy is my favorite. It happened that I paid money to redeem him. He was just fostered in Ziwiun Tower. Zhang Duo is loved by others. Isn't that bad? This kind of situation is not uncommon in Beijing. It is difficult to bring a prostitute or a young man back to the house, so he is fostered in Chuguan, a brothel. Whoever pays for it belongs to him, and no one else is allowed to touch him. When Mr. Zhang heard this, he hurriedly stepped forward to persuade him and said, Your Highness, I'm afraid there is a misunderstanding. I know Quan Zi best. He is not a good man. Really? Xieting Zhou glanced at Mr. Zhang with a half-smile, then looked at Zhang Lianzi and said, If you're not a good man, then give him back to me. Zhang Lianzi underestimated him and didn't expect Xieting Zhou to use such a move. Xieting Zhou's Fangping is just like that, he can do anything. I don't have the person the prince mentioned in my house. I'm afraid the information is wrong. The prince should look elsewhere. Xieting Zhou lowered his hand, You've already come, so there's no reason to go back empty-handed. I have to see it myself to know. He took a step forward, and Zhang Lianzi stood in front of him and said in a deep voice, This is Jiang's mansion, not your Balin prince's mansion. Xieting Zhou had a knife in his eyes. He leaned forward slightly and said in Zhang Lianzi's ear, If it were my Balin palace, do you think you can still stand here and talk to me? He straightened up and looked at Zhang Lianzi as if he were looking at a pile of garbage. Zhang Lianzi was hit hard on the shoulder, and Xieting Zhou had already strode out the door. Xieting Zhou looked up at the sky. White feathers swooped down from the sky and landed on his shoulders. They only stayed for a moment, then flapped their wings and took off again, making two sharp chirps in the air. Sure enough, he was in the house. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Treating the Concubine, Eliminating the Wife, Reborn, I Refuse to Marry the Scumbag and Marry the Prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 117. Xieting Zhou raised his feet and left. Zhang Lianzi said sternly, Stop him. The servants of the house immediately stepped forward to stop him. Swish. Xieting Zhou's men pressed the knife at their waist, and their thumbs had already pushed the knife out of the scabbard. The ordinary servants were no match for the guards, they were inferior in terms of momentum alone. When Ms. Zhang saw the fight, she hurriedly stepped forward to persuade him, If you have anything to say, you two are officials in the same court, why should it be like this? She looked at Xieting Zhou with a calm expression, Although you are the heir apparent, this is the Zhang mansion. Even if you want to search the manor, you have to come up with documents. Who said I'm going to search the house? I'm looking for someone. Xieting Zhou looked back and said, It's not yours. There's no point in occupying it. Why should you? Zhang Lianzi said, If it's not mine, is it yours? Then why not call her out and ask her to see who she says she is? The two of them went back and forth, but no one except 11 Feng and Conway understood. Zhang Lianzi said in a deep voice, "If you search the house today, my Zhang family will lose face." Xieting Zhou said, "I said I won't search the mansion. I will only look for people in your courtyard. If I don't find the person I'm looking for, how about I hold a banquet in the capital for 3 days to apologize to the Zhang mansion?" Mr. Zhang has been holding back his anger. The most unpromising person in the Zhang family is himself, but he has given birth to the most promising son. He raised his voice and said, "Then let him search. I want to see if he can find it." Zhang Lianzi clenched his fists and did not answer. Mrs. Zhang felt bad when she saw this. "Lianzi, have you?" Mrs. Zhang did not finish her words because she had already gotten the answer from Zhang Lianzi's face. Zhang Lianzi was silent for a long time, and then said to Xieting Zhou, "You said you were only looking for people in my courtyard." Xieting Zhou's heart skipped a beat. Didn't Zhang Lianzi bring him back? No, Bai Yu came to report just now. It was clear that Bai Yu and Wang had found Shen Yu. How could Zhang Lianzi have the courage to let him search her? It was useless to think too much, so Xieting Zhou raised his feet and walked away, with Zhang Mansion's servant leading the way. Zhang Lianzi walked aside and glanced at a boy in the yard calmly. The boy nodded slightly, slowed down, and walked towards the other road, avoiding people, and walked faster and faster. There was a clang sound, and a long knife was inserted into the wall. The boy stopped suddenly. The knife was right in front of his neck, and the blade was still shaking. The boy was frozen in place, breaking out in cold sweat. If he had walked half a step faster, he would probably be dead and dismembered by now. Xieting Zhou said nothing and gave Zhang Lianzi a look in return. Before they reached the place, they heard a burst of dog barking, accompanied by Bai Yu's sharp bark. When I got closer, I saw several people holding a net. Rhubarb was trapped in the net and screamed. The white feathers were flexible and rushed down from time to catch or peck, making several people confused. "Zai Feng," Xieting Zhou shouted coldly. 11 Feng stepped forward. With a swish sound, he drew the knife and returned it to the sheath in an instant, and the net was chopped into pieces in an instant. De Wang shook his head, ran over and barked at Xieting Zhou twice, then barked wildly at the courtyard door. 11 Feng kicked open the courtyard door, and the guards rushed in. Xieting Zhou went straight to the bedroom. The curtains were lowered, and a figure could be vaguely seen lying on the bed. Xieting Zhou's heartbeat quickened and he grabbed the curtain and gently opened it. The person on the bed suddenly opened his eyes. "Ah, who are you?" Xieting Zhou was stunned, loosened his grip, and took a step back. "How so?" The person on the bed opened the curtain and got out of bed. She was dressed like a palace maid. She glanced at Zhang Lianzi behind Xieting Zhou and called out delicately, "Master Zhang." Zhang Lian stepped forward and said, "The prince saw it? This is the only person in my room. I still don't know who the prince is looking for. This is the maid given by the fourth prince. If the prince likes it, I can give it to you." The bedroom was rummaged through, even the cabinets were not spared, but no one was found. Xieting Zhou stepped out of the room and Zhang Lianzi smiled, "When the prince holds a banquet, I will definitely take the whole family there." Walking into the courtyard, Xieting Zhou stopped and looked back at the bedroom. He had an intuition that Shen Yu was in that room, not far from him. The big yellow pestle refused to leave at the door and shouted at Xieting Zhou. Xieting Zhou's eyes narrowed and he rushed back quickly. Zhang Lianzi's expression changed and he clenched his fists. "What should I do?" Gao Jin asked in a low voice. "Zhang Lianzi, he can't find him." The next words were stuck in his throat. Xieting Zhou was already standing at the door. The person in his arms was covered tightly by the cloak, not even a finger was exposed. "Servant Zhang," Xieting Zhou stared at Zhang Lianzi, his voice cold, "we will settle today's debt later." For some reason, Zhang Lian subconsciously took 2 steps away and watched as people passed by him. The carriage shook slightly, and Shen Yu leaned in Xie Ting's arms. She was not conscious. The bed has a mechanism and a layer under the bed board. She heard the cries of Bai Yu and Wang, and also heard Xie Ting's voice close at hand before she forced herself to wake up. When she opened her eyes, it was the bed board. She was so weak that she could only dig at the board with her fingers and call his name in a low voice, but no one could hear her voice. When she heard Xie Tingzhou gradually walking away, she almost despaired at that moment. Xie Tingzhou let her sit in his arms and touched her forehead with his chin, a sign of restraint and forbearance. "It's okay, sleep peacefully." Shen Yu still raised her head slightly, her unclear eyes stubbornly falling on his face. She shouted uncertainly, "Thank you, stop the boat." A low and hoarse voice rang in her ears, "Yes, I'm here." Her half-closed eyes struggled several times, and her long curled eyelashes trembled several times, but she still insisted on not sleeping. "Thank you Tingzhou," she called him again, still worried. Xie Tingzhou knew that she had always had strong willpower, and even now she was about to lose consciousness and she was still forcing herself. He sighed softly, hugged her and lifted her up a little, finding a more comfortable position for her. He looked down at her face and coaxed in a low voice, "Go to sleep. I'll call you when I get home." "Okay," she said like a mosquito. Xie Ting's heart felt like it had been cut by countless knives. He raised his hand and gently crossed her eyebrows, lowered his head, and pressed his thin lips to her forehead. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi. Chapter 118. Watching her gradually fall asleep, Xie Tingzhou slowly raised his head. "Zai Feng. Here we are." 11 Feng immediately got off the horse and got into the carriage, hesitating for a moment before opening the curtain. Xie Ting's red eyes caught the eye of the 11 Feng, and his hair stood on end. "Your Highness." The word stuck on his lips. He had never seen Xie Tingzhou be so out of sorts. Xie Tingzhou looked past him into the void, arrange a secret guard to escape from the palace. Zai Feng immediately understood that the palace was currently looking for an assassin. If no one could be found, suspicion would probably be cast on those who left the palace, and then they would be able to trace the clues to Shijie. "Yes, I'll make arrangements right away." Xie Tingzhou lowered his eyes to look at the person in his arms again. After a while, he said softly, "Go down." Xie Tingzhou stayed up all night last night. He kept himself energetic during the day. Once his tense nerves relaxed, he felt sleepy all over. After returning home, he leaned on the couch, holding Shen Yu in his arms, and fell asleep in a daze. I don't know how many times the sound was heard, and the shadows of the dancing trees were reflected on the windows. Shen Yu opened her eyes in a daze. There was a chair beside the couch, and Xie Tingzhou was sitting in it, staring down at her face. "Woke up." Shen Yu opened her eyes half awake and half confused, and nodded slowly, not wanting to say a word. She slept very well, as if she hadn't had such a solid sleep in a long time. She turned over and lay lazily on the couch, not wanting to move much. "What time is it?" Xie Tingzhou leaned forward and pulled up the slipping quilt for her. "I just passed the ugly time." He picked her up in the evening and slept with her for 2 hours before waking up, but she slept until midnight. "In another hour, it will be dawn." Shen Yu raised her eyes. When she closed her eyes in the carriage, she didn't fall asleep immediately. She knew the fingers touching her face and the soft touch on her forehead. She stared at Xie Tingzhou intently, feeling that it was like a dream, and it was clearer and more charming than in the dream. Xie Tingzhou suddenly asked, "What are you looking at me for?" Shen Yu immediately closed her eyes and said, "I won't watch it anymore." Xie Tingzhou leaned closer and hooked her chin. "Shen Yu, look at me." Shen Yu heard his shallow breathing, and her whole body seemed to be enveloped in a faint scent of pine. She couldn't tell whether it came from his bed or from him. She didn't dare to open her eyes. I'll let you look at it for a while, but you won't let me look at it for a while. What do you want? Shen Yu was stunned. A piece of softness suddenly appeared on his forehead. This time it was much clearer than the last time. When Shen Yu opened her eyes, she could only see his lower jaw, and the tip of her nose was less than 3 inches away from his Adam's apple. His Adam's apple was rolling, so close that he could hear each other's heartbeats. The scent of pine wood became stronger, and seemed to be even more powerful than Zhonglianzi's incense. It made people indulge in it, and even the fingers holding the quilt had no strength. Xieting Zhou slowly backed away and closed his eyes heavily. Now, can you look at me? Shen Yu had not yet recovered from the kiss and looked at his face blankly. Are you stupid? Xieting Zhou grabbed her hand, opened her hand and held it in his palm. Silly girl, he whispered, if someone is so scornful of you, you should slap him on the spot or slit his neck with a knife. You can't let people bully you like this. The palm of her hand was slightly itchy. Shen Yu let his thumb stroke the row of crescent marks pressed by the nails. I will not be bullied. Then why don't you hit me? Huh? Xieting Zhou asked again. He knew that she was tough but stubborn, and he guided her to give him an answer. Shen Yu's heart was confused. She bit her lower lip and remained silent. On the way to Beijing, it was clear that he could tease Xieting Zhou speechlessly with just his mouth. But at the critical moment, he couldn't say a word. Xieting Zhou sighed, fearing that pushing her too hard would make her shrink back. He stood up and walked to the table and drank half of the cold tea. He tapped his fingers on the table a few times as if he was thinking about something. Then he took another cup and poured her a cup of hot tea. Shen Yu sat up from the bed hugging the quilt, took a sip of tea, and asked, have you been up all night again? Sleep. How did you sleep? Xieting Zhou half smiled, which made Shen Yu feel panicky. Sleeping on the couch. Shen Yu's heart beat wildly, and then she thought again, the two of them had slept countless times on the way to Beijing, so what's the point of sleeping together? So she calmed down. I heard something last night. Xieting Zhou looked at her. What did you find out? The incense made her sleep for most of the day. She combed it carefully and said, when I was in Dali Temple, the Jin Yi Wei just came to pick up someone. There must be something wrong with Emperor Tongxue bringing Ji Liangji to the palace in the middle of the night, so I followed the prison car in. The palace. It's too risky, Xieting Zhou said solemnly. I'll pay attention next time, Shen Yu said with a guilty conscience. Xieting Zhou raised his eyes. You can check the clues slowly, but you can't risk yourself. Shen Yu opened her mouth to speak, but closed her mouth again, with a look of shame and anger on her face. After a while, she punched the edge of the bed and said, can you please speak properly? Xieting Zhou was stunned for a moment. Why didn't I talk properly? You just... Shen Yu paused. Let's just talk about things. Why do you talk so much and have nothing? Xieting Zhou was stunned for a moment, then suddenly laughed. Okay, I'll explain it properly. Shen Yu felt something was wrong again. She would say it nicely, but she had to use such a doting tone. Why did she want to do that? Any more questions? Xieting Zhou asked when he saw her expression was different. Shen Yu looked away. No, let's talk carefully now. Xieting Zhou nodded, the smile on his lips not diminishing. He thought she looked so cute. Drink some tea first. Shen Yu drank all the tea in the cup and was about to put it on the small table next to her when Xieting Zhou took it. Xieting Zhou said, go ahead. Shen Yu thought for a while and recounted the news she learned from Ji Liangji in the Dali Temple prison, as well as the conversation between Emperor Tongxue and Ji Liangji. Xieting Zhou pondered for a long time. The life-saving charm that Ji Liangji left for his children must be something that the other party is afraid of. It may be evidence that it can take the other party's life. Shen Yu nodded, I thought so too. Later in the palace, Ji Liangji said that he was one of the moths, which meant that he was indeed involved in the matter, but there were other masterminds. Emperor Tongxue obviously also knew who those people were, but he didn't want to move or didn't dare to move. Xie Zhou tapped the empty cup with his index finger. Shen Yu saw that he was thinking and didn't want to disturb his thoughts, so she waited quietly. After a long time, the tapping fingers stopped, and Xie Zhou put the cup on the low table aside. What does Emperor Tongxue care about most? Shen Yu was startled and said uncertainly, it should be, De Zhou's kingdom. That's right, Xie Zhou said, the battle at Yan Liangwen has damaged the foundation of the Zhou dynasty, but in the eyes of Emperor Tongxue, what is more terrifying than removing these cancers? Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi. Chapter 119. Shen Yu remembered the 5 major evils mentioned by Emperor Tongxue and his evaluation of several princes. The eunuch's struggle for power has been resolved, but the traitors dare not get rid of them even though they want to, and there is a party struggle within. An idea flashed in her mind, and she murmured, both and flesh can kill each other. Xie Zhou said, the only one who can be ranked above the traitor is the one who can kill each other. He obviously knows that he can't last much longer. There are not many princes who are worthy of big posts. I remembered Shen Yu said, Ji Liangji once said something to me. He said that maybe my direction was wrong from the beginning. The reason they killed my father was not because of his great achievements or vendetta, but because it's for self-protection. Prince, succession, struggle for power, self-protection, Shen Yu connected these words one by one. In the battle for the throne, the winner is crowned with a yellow robe, while the loser is shattered to pieces. Shen Zhong'an has an army of 100,000, so he must be the target of the princes competing to win over him. Under what circumstances can it be called self-protection? That is knowing that Shen Zhong'an has become a major obstacle to the other party's ascension to the throne and has to be eliminated. The more Shen Yu thought about it, the more frightened she became, and her hands holding the quilt were trembling. Xie Zhou held her hand and said, Shen Yu, look at me. Shen Yu raised her eyes to look at Xie Zhou with bloodshot eyes, they are so heartbroken. For the sake of the throne, they. Xie Zhou comforted him, this is how the royal family is. How many princes have died in the struggle for the throne, and even their own parents and brothers can be killed. Who can't be abandoned? His voice gradually became lower and he suddenly smiled bitterly, don't talk about the royal family, the same goes for princes, generals, and ministers. Shen Yu noticed the disappointment in his words and looked at his face. Half of Xie Zhou's face was hidden in the candle light, his profile was cold and gloomy, gradually filled his eyebrows. He stared at the empty space for a long time, and then his eyes suddenly hit Shen Yu's worried face. The gloom that was stirring in her chest quietly retreated due to her glance. Worried about me? He asked. Shen Yu was silent for a moment and nodded honestly, are you sad about something? Yes, Xie Zhou said, but when you look at me like this, I suddenly don't feel sad anymore. His voice was very deep, very pleasant, and full of bewitching meaning. Xie Zhou's Adam's apple rolled down and his eyes darkened, then, give me a hug. Okay. His eyes were dark, but not stained with lust. The strong and gentle Xie Zhou showed such a fragile expression for the first time. Shen Yu felt soft and felt distressed. She slowly reached out and ran her fingers across his arm, then his shoulder. Before she could hug him, she was already hugged by his strong arms. The banging of bangs outside was loud and urgent, and it was already the last watch. A lamp was lit outside, and the screen was half transparent. The shadow of Xie Zhou changing clothes fell on the screen. Shen Yu lay on her side on the bed, staring at Xie Zhou's outline on the screen. After getting dressed, Xie Zhou walked in again. Shen Yu saw the court clothes on his body and sat up, Are you going to court? Xieting Zhou received a sinecure with a title but no power, and he did not need to go to court on weekdays. Xieting Zhou said yeah, Ji Liangji was executed yesterday, and something happened in the palace. Let's go and have a look. Shen Yu nodded and said, then I'll go back to Lu Mingxian. Don't worry, Xieting Zhou stopped her, the doctor will come to check your pulse in the morning. I don't know if the incense yesterday did any damage to your body. You can sleep a little longer. It's still early, so I'll leave first. When he reached the door, he turned around. She was sitting on the edge of the couch in her pajamas. When she saw him turning around, she smiled at him. Xieting Zhou suddenly felt like an ordinary couple, the husband who got up early and the wife who was saying goodbye. She saw him off when he went out and waited for him when he came home. He smiled back, turned and walked out the door. If it was like this every day, Shen Jing would not seem so boring. Shen Yu slept all day and couldn't fall asleep at all. The smell on the couch made her feel at ease. She didn't get up until Chen Shi to wash up. The doctor came to check her pulse and said that her pulse was normal. The incense was harmless to people and had a soothing effect, but the dosage was a little too heavy. The maid came in to prepare breakfast. Shen Yu was eating. When she raised her eyes, she saw Chang Lu sticking his head in at the door. What are you doing there? Come in. Chang Liu came in with his hands behind his back, looked at Shen Yu and then looked inside, wondering, did you sleep with our highness last night? Shen Yu was drinking porridge, and when he asked her, she almost spat out a mouthful of porridge. It was hard to hold it back, which made her cough. Chang Liu was startled and quickly poured a glass of water. Don't hurt me. Your Highness asked me not to disturb you. Your Highness will punish me if you cough to death. It's not just a punishment for you. Uncle Zhong walked in, put down his things, and said, His Highness will have to skin you. Chang Lu touched his neck and looked Shen Yu up and down. What kind of ecstasy soup did you pour into His Highness? I used to be the most favored person in the palace. Shen Yu smiled dryly and said, You still are. Uncle Zhong opened the lid and placed a cup of red date bird's nest in front of Shen Yu. Drink it while it's hot. From now on, you have to drink a cup every day. It nourishes yin and kidneys, and is good for the body. Shen Yu felt dizzy when she heard the words nourishing yin and nourishing kidneys. Fortunately, Chang Liu didn't catch it and said quickly, No need. It's useful, drink it quickly. Chang Liu looked over. He loved sweets, and the sweet aroma of red dates and birds' nests made him greedy. Why don't you give it to me if it's good for your health? What do your children eat at home? Chang Lu pointed at Shen Yu. He pointed at himself. He is less than a year older than me. Isn't he a child? Let's wait until you are older than her, Uncle Zhong said perfunctorily, then looked at Shen Yu with a smile on his face. How is it? How does it taste? If you don't like it, I will ask the kitchen to adjust the recipe. After a long swish, he turned his back, sat on the chair and became sulky. Very good, Shen Yu laughed dryly. That's good. After Uncle Zhong finished speaking, he glanced at Shen Yu and suddenly sighed with a heavy face. Shen Yu, Uncle Zhong, is there something wrong? Uncle Zhong said solemnly, His Royal Highness is entering the palace today. I don't know whether it is good or bad. Shen Yu put down the spoon. What happened? Isn't His Highness not allowed to speak? Chang Liu turned around and asked. Shut up. Uncle Zhong stuffed a snack into Chang Liu's mouth and turned to Shen Yu solemnly. You don't know something. In order to rescue you yesterday, His Highness led troops to surround Zhang Mansion. Where is Zhang Mansion? That is the head of the 4 great families. Our ancestors had 1 taifu, 2 chief assistants, 3 ministers, and countless other official positions. Uncle Zhong tried to be as serious as possible. Shen Yu was secretly shocked. She only knew that Xieting Zhou had rescued her, but she forgot to ask him what method he used. She didn't expect that it would cause such a big fuss. Uncle Zhong said, Our Highness is good at everything, but he likes to suffer himself and reports good things but not bad things. Shen Yu couldn't eat any more. No wonder Xie Zhou had to go to the palace early in the morning. Will something happen? I don't know, Uncle Zhong said, but if you wait outside the palace gate, you will definitely know the news as soon as possible. Chang Lu was about to speak, but saw Uncle Zhong wink at him. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Treating the Concubine, Eliminating the Wife, Reborn, I Refuse to Marry the Scumbag and Marry the Prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 120. Go to court at Mao Hour. As soon as Xie Zhou stepped into Chengtian Gate, Li Jifeng hurried over. He lowered his voice and said, You are on the cusp of the storm now, why did you come to the court? Do you know how big the trouble was yesterday? I know, Xie Zhou said, that's why I'm here. Li Jifeng originally wanted to persuade him to go back, but he was willing to shoot him. He stamped his feet and followed Xie Zhou to Suanhui Hall. Tell me what's going on. The Zhang family's influence in the court is intricate. If someone in the hall makes an attack on you later, I can help you. He's my brother, he can't be bullied. Xie Zhou glanced at him and said, Zhang Ji stole my man. Did he really steal your mistress? Li Jifeng also heard what was going on, but he felt that that was not Xie Zhou's style, or that the waiter was so beautiful that even Xie Zhou and Zhang Ji couldn't resist. There were all the officials outside the palace. As soon as the two arrived, a group of them looked over. Look, Li Jifeng whispered, these must be their henchmen. Xie Zhou smiled and moved forward instead of retreating. He walked to a place 3 steps away from Zhang Lian and stopped. Yesterday Mr. Zhang was still rosy. How come he is so haggard after only 1 day? You don't understand. Li Jifeng took the opportunity to sing a double act. Children cry for candy, let alone adults. The implication is that Zhang Lianzi is putting on airs, deliberately pretending to be like this to gain sympathy. The minister standing behind Zhang Lianzi was holding back his anger and was about to complain for Zhang Lianzi, but Zhang Lianzi raised his hand to stop him. Your Majesty, please don't bully others too much. Is it too much to bully others? Xie Zhou and Shi Shiren shook his sleeves. Then Mr. Zhang, please don't covet talents that are not your own. Li Jifeng helped, yes. Don't covet him. Xie Zhou was speechless and glanced sideways at him. Li Jifeng looked confused, what are you looking at me doing? Xie Zhou walked away and whispered to Li Jifeng, no matter how they attack in the palace later, don't speak. Why? Li Jifeng asked. In Honglu Temple, the whip was fired 3 times, and all the officials were silent. After singing and playing, they entered the temple one by one. Ji Liangji had just been executed yesterday, so many people probably breathed a sigh of relief. After the report, a minister stood up and said, I have my own source to report. Coming. Xie Zhou looked back and saw that it was Zhang Huaixing, the right deputy censor of the capital. Emperor Tongxiu, yes. Zhang Huaixing saluted and said, today I impeached Xie Yun, the prince of Bailin and the commander of the capital, recruited private soldiers, and led troops to besiege the residence of the chief minister. I simply ignored the law and the country's structure. I always regarded the outline as nothing. I please handle it strictly, Your Majesty. Xie Zhou was calm and composed, and he even smiled lightly when he heard several I second my opinion in the palace. Master Zhang, you said that I recruited private soldiers. Where did this accusation come from? Zhang Huaixing said, Your Majesty, you still dare to quibble. Many people saw those who besieged Zhang Mansion yesterday. Do you still want to deny it? Then have you counted it? How many are there in total? Zhang Huaixing said angrily, there are so many people, How can I count them one by one? Xieting Zhou said, since I haven't counted it, how can you think that I have exceeded the regulations? Zhang Huixing said, according to the law, the prince has 36 guards and 20 personal guards. The prince can't be higher than the prince's regulations, right? Of course it's nothing compared to the prince. Xieting Zhou looked at Emperor Tongxiu. When I came to the capital, your majesty authorized me to regulate the vassal and lead 3 guard camps. It stands to reason that the total yesterday's total was less than 1 guard camp. Half of it? Zhang Huixing, this. Emperor Tongxiu nodded, that is indeed the case. How could Zhang Huixing know about the conditions reached privately between Emperor Tongxiu and Balin, and he could not come to Taiwan for a while? Even so, what's the explanation for surrounding the residence of Lord Chief Assistant without authorization? Xieting Zhou glanced at Zhang Lian and said, why don't you ask Mr. Zhang what's going on? How can the Luan Palace allow you to push back and block me? Xieting Zhou smiled coldly, when will it be your turn to question this prince again? Wan Ruxian, the left deputy capital censor, was just about to go out, but he saw Xieting Zhou sweeping the crowd quietly, his eyes lingering on him for a moment longer. He understood instantly, and a thin layer of sweat broke out on his back. Fortunately, he didn't speak for Xieting Zhou just now. Emperor Tongxiu was afraid of Balin. How would Emperor Tongxiu react if he knew that there was someone from Xieting Zhou in the court? Now that no one speaks for Xieting Zhou, Emperor Tongxiu feels more at ease, but he doesn't know how to deal with it. Master Zhang. Xieting Zhou didn't even look at Zhang Lianzi. Why don't we explain everything clearly in the palace today? Zhang Lianzi was forced to step out. There was a slight friction between the minister and the prince. Xieting Zhou said leisurely, it's not easy to talk about this matter in the palace, but since Mr. Zhang has read my book, I still have to make it clear. I usually hang out in the Qin Tower and Chu Hall, and I don't hide it from you. There is a beloved waiter. As soon as these words came out, there was an uproar in the palace. How could such an unsavory matter be mentioned in court? It was simply unseemly. Xieting Zhou continued, it's a coincidence that Mr. Lian Zhang, a clean and self-sufficient person, actually fell in love with the same person as me and secretly abducted the person in the house. If it was ordinary, it would be fine, but what about the one he loves? Can give in. What nonsense! Just because you are the Prince of Balin, you are falsely accusing the imperial officials. That's nonsense. How could Mr. Zhang do such an unruly thing if he is a noble man? Xieting Zhou looked at Zhang Lianzi, Master Zhang, how are you doing? Zhang Lianzi clenched his fists. If he spoke frankly, he would involve Shen Yu. Did Xieting Zhou calculate that he didn't dare, or did he mean that Shen Yu was not that important in Xieting Zhou's heart at all? Zhang Lianzi picked up his robe and knelt down. It is true that this has happened. I have lost my decency. I hope your majesty will forgive me. This is the default. Those who spoke so well just now were speechless. Zhang Huixing was sweating profusely. There were some shady things going on in the homes of wealthy families, but he didn't expect Zhang Lianzi to be such a person. If he hadn't impeached Xieting Zhou today, how could he have made the affairs of Zhang Lian's house public to the public? Xieting Zhou smiled and said, Your Majesty knows what my virtues are. I'm used to being a bastard. If I can't even find a servant, then staying here in Shengjing will be boring. Shengjing is boring, where is the fun? Isn't it Balin? How could Emperor Tongxiu let the tiger go back to the mountain? In the final analysis, it was just 2 sons of aristocratic families who were jealous over a trick, and it was inappropriate to bring it to court. But it is a fact that Xieting Zhou surrounded Zhang Mansion yesterday. If he does not give Zhang Mansion an explanation, it will not be justified in front of all the civil and military officials. In the future, the children of aristocratic families will follow suit. Today you will surround me with your servants, and tomorrow I will surround you with my servants. It will be a mess. Emperor Tongxue pondered for a moment and said, "It is indeed unbecoming of you and me to be jealous over a little boy, so I will fine Xie Yun with a month's suspension." 1 month. Xie Tingzhou sighed. When Li Jifeng heard this, a month was okay. He had been grounded by the emperor for half a month and would have died. He took a step forward and said, "Father, it was clearly Minister Zhang who snatched the boat first, why did he only punish one to stop the boat?" "Shut up," Emperor Tongxue said in a deep voice, "Zhang Ji is now in charge of the household department. He is not suspended for the time being. He will be punished with a salary of 3 months. Do you have any objections?" "I accept the decree. I accept the decree. Thank you for stopping the boat," and Zhongli and Zi both said in unison. "But," Xie Tingzhou protracted, "Your Majesty, I see that there is no one in the backyard of Minister Zhang, and he is reduced to hanging around the Chu Palace like me. It really damages the image of Minister Zhang, who is noble and upright. Minister Zhang is different from me. He but the pillar of the country." Emperor Tongxue heard what Xie Tingzhou said between the lines. Zhang Ji has passed the age of weakness and is not yet married. It is time to put the marriage proposal on the agenda. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Zhiji. Chapter 121. After the court was over, Xie Tingzhou walked out of Suanhui Hall. Li Jifeng was detained by Emperor Tongxue for a while, and he chased him to Chengtian Gate before catching up with him. "Please walk slower. Are you in a hurry to go back and hug your mistress?" Xie Tingzhou looked back at him and realized that he was half right. He was indeed anxious to go back and see the person, but whether he would be allowed to be hugged or not was still a question. Li Jifeng finally caught up, cleared his throat, turned his head and asked in a low voice, "Was I handsome just now?" Xie Tingzhou glanced at him and said, "Your dad's shut up sound is more handsome." "How could you do this?" Li Jifeng said dissatisfied, "I am speaking for you. Why are you following me?" Li Jifeng said, "Aren't you grounded? I'm worried that you are too bored to stay with you at your house. Oh, by the way, you have now moved on and fallen in love with the mistress. I have been living in your house these days, so what are you doing? Give it to me, Shijie." Xie Tingzhou stopped suddenly, looked at Li Jifeng and narrowed his eyes. "What did you say?" Li Jifeng didn't notice at all and said to himself, "Shijie, don't you like it anymore? You have a crush on her?" "Yeah, wait a minute." Li Jifeng took a step back warily, and the murderous intent on Xie Tingzhou's face was a bit heavy. He immediately realized that he was so proud of Xie Tingzhou. Even if some people refused to thank Tingzhou, it would not be the turn of others. No, no." Li Jifeng hurriedly explained, "Hey, don't stare at me like that. It's scary. Let's talk while walking, okay?" Xie Tingzhou raised his feet and walked away. Li Jifeng said at the side, "I am attracted to him, but not because of his person, but because of his chess skills." Xie Tingzhou was stunned. "Do you like her chess skills?" "There are still people interested in Shen Yu's skill of stealing one of his sons even if he has no time for it. Could it be that he is blind?" Li Jifeng said, "It's no fun for me to play chess with anyone. They either let me win on purpose, or they kill me like you so that I can't fight back. But you know that I am a chess lover. One of my biggest wishes in life is to compete with others on the chessboard. I think Shijie is on the same level as me. How about you? Lend him to me." "Xie Tingzhou, I won't borrow it." Li Jifeng asked, "Why?" "It's just a chess game." "Because?" Xie Tingzhou paused because he had already seen the carriage of his palace outside the palace gate. "Uncle Zhong and Changliu are here. Could it be that something happened to the palace?" Xie Tingzhou quickened his pace. Uncle Zhong saw him from a distance and hurried to meet him. "Your Highness." "Xie Tingzhou, what's the matter?" "Your Highness, don't be anxious." Uncle Zhong said, "It's like this. Somehow, Shija found out about the incident at Wajiang Mansion yesterday. She was worried that His Highness would be reprimanded by the Holy Master and couldn't sit still at home. She was really uneasy and had to go there. "We'll pick you up at the palace gate." After Uncle Zhong finished speaking, he turned his eyes and saw Changliu's stunned expression. He calmly raised his hand to close Changliu's chin. Xietingzhou looked at the carriage and asked, "Is she inside?" "I came here just after breakfast and have been waiting," Uncle Zhong said. Xietingzhou was thinking a lot and quickly walked over and got on the carriage. Li Jifeng was left alone, then he reacted and chased after him. Uncle Zhong said when he got on the carriage, "Your Majesty, Ninth Prince, this carriage is too small, why not?" Li Jifeng waved his hand, "It's okay, just squeeze in." At the entrance of the palace, Zhang Lianzi paused for a long time looking at the direction the carriage was leaving. Xietingzhou is really bullying people too much. Zhang Lianzi looked away. "He used AU to control me, can't I use AU to control him?" The carriage drove up the long street. Uncle Zhong thought the carriage was too big and the two of them were too far apart, so he specially changed to a smaller carriage today. Xietingzhou looked at the uninvited guest, Li Jifeng, with a worried look on his face. Shen Yu had been waiting all morning, and now she was relieved to see Xietingzhou come out unscathed. This is not a trivial matter. How was it resolved? Xietingzhou looked at her and said, "A month of grounding." Shen Yu nodded, "If it's just a month of confinement, that's fine." Xietingzhou's eyes moved twice and suddenly sighed. "What's wrong?" Shen Yu asked hurriedly. Xietingzhou sighed, "Emperor Tongxiu scolded me severely in the court, and his carelessness was outrageous. He asked me to be careful in my words and deeds in the future." Li Jifeng was stunned. Xietingzhou clearly killed all the civil and military officials in the court with just one mouth. Even Emperor Su couldn't do anything to him and didn't even say a harsh word to him. Now he has suffered great grievances. Similar. Li Jifeng raised his hand and pointed at Tingzhou, "You clearly." "Shen Yu, clearly what?" "You still have to be careful with your words and actions." Xietingzhou looked at Li Jifeng with a faint look in his eyes and murmured again. Li Jifeng was not stupid. How could he not hear the warning from Xietingzhou? He took a breath and said, "You were obviously scolded so hard that you couldn't lift your head, but now you are so light-hearted and calm about what you suffered in the palace. The grievance has been brushed aside. As brothers, I feel sorry for you." Li Jifeng also beat his chest seriously. Xietingzhou glanced at him, was this too much? But judging from the way Shen Yu looked at him, it seemed like the effect was pretty good. He finally discovered that Shen Yu seemed to be strong, but in fact she was hard-spoken and soft-hearted. He showed weakness last night, so she held him and comforted him for a long time. What would the situation be like if Li Jifeng wasn't there at this moment? Shen Yu lowered her eyes, filled with guilt. If she had not gone to the palace alone to inquire about the news, she would not have fallen into the hands of Zhang Lian, and Xietingzhou would not have been surrounded by Zhang Mansion, grounded, and reprimanded. Xietingzhou's heart thumped. It's over, the drama has gone too far. His intention was not to make her feel guilty, he was just showing weakness. He touched her hand under the table and comforted, "It's okay, I just said a few words, I didn't listen." Li Jifeng looked at the two people opposite him and thought that Xietingzhou was still pretending. As brothers, he must praise him for this today. He adjusted his tone and sighed, "Reprimanding in court is a matter of dignity, respect." Xietingzhou raised his feet. "Ah!" Li Jifeng screamed in pain and covered his knees, "Why are you kicking me?" Xietingzhou asked sadly, "What did you say you respect just now?" Li Jifeng gritted his teeth and remained silent. "You are awesome, you are teasing others, and I am being kicked. Where is the justice?"